Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and welcome to Biology Essentials video number 11. This is on the origin of life and what science can tell us about the history of life on our planet. This is also the last video in this first unit, which is on evolution. When Darwin was starting to formulate his ideas of evolution, natural selection in the second half of the 1800s, another scientist was trying to answer another big piece to that puzzle, and that's Lord Kelvin. And he was trying to figure out, well, how old is the Earth? And the way he did that is he figured out that the Earth was probably, or started as a molten rock, or molten material, and then he just used heat change. In other words, how long would it take for the Earth to cool down to the point where rock could actually form? And the values he kept getting were somewhere between about 20 and maybe 100 million years ago. And so he eventually kind of narrowed that down to between 20 and 40. And other scientists at that time were coming up with similar values. The problem with that is that Darwin's idea of natural selection and life coming through this somewhat random process played against the environment, that just wasn't long enough time for life to have gone through all of its different transitions. And so Kelvin was making two mistakes in his calculations. And so the first one is he didn't understand that you could have radioactive heating of the crust. In other words, you're going to have radiation that's going to radiate and it's actually going to warm up that crust. And the other thing they didn't understand back then is convection, that there were convection currents that were actually warming up the crust. And so these calculations of in the millions of years were off. And so it wasn't until the 1900s that we actually got an accurate approximation of how old the Earth is. We know that the Earth is about the same age as the solar system itself. And so what you do is you figure out things that were around in that early formation of the solar system, and those are called meteorites. And so we can date meteorites using lead dating, and we can figure out how old they are. And so now you just have to find where those meteorites are. And so this is a meteorite that we use for a lot of those approximations of how old the Earth was. It's called the Canyon Diablo meteorite. Crashed into Arizona, and they found this years ago. But Patterson, C.C. Patterson, was the first person to actually make a good approximation of how old the Earth was. And using meteorites and using this dating, we figured out that the Earth now, and this is kind of our accepted value, is about 4.55 billion years ago. So roughly 4.6 billion years ago. And so that gives us plenty of time to figure out or go through the fossil record and figure out how life came to be. And so what I'm going to talk about in this podcast are the origin of life, and specifically what science can tell us about that transition from no life to life that we have today. We're going to use three different threads or three different domains. The first one is going to be geology, so we're going to look at the geologic record. Essentially, we're going to look at fossils and see what secrets fossils can unlock in telling us about the history of life. Next, we're going to talk about chemistry and that famous Stanley Miller-Harold-Urey experiment, or the Miller-Urey experiment. And we're going to show how chemistry can answer some of these answers of how life could be. And then finally, we're going to look at molecular evidence, and we're going to see how there are homologous. Remember, homologous means structures that are shared by all those related organisms. Homologous molecules or monomers that have been passed through time. And it's also going to point to, this molecular evidence is going to point to what's called the last universal ancestor. In other words, what's that one ancestor that's shared by all living things today? And Darwin talked about that in The Origin of the Species, saying that there was one common ancestor, all life on our planet. And so now we have a better answer if Darwin were around today. First, let's look at the geologic evidence. If we look back through time, so we're saying that life started maybe 4.6 billion years ago. This first period of time, and again, you don't have to memorize any of these different names, but the Hadean era is the first era, and that's essentially comes from Hades, which tells us what the Earth was like at that point in time. So it was a molten material. We were constantly getting hit by large structures from space, and so the whole thing was molten, and life really couldn't exist during that period of time. What's interesting is the point at which life could actually exist, it shows up. And so life starts here. There are going to be approximately somewhere between 3.5, 3.8 billion years ago. Some of the first life that we find on our planet are in these fossils called stromatolites, and it's essentially a bacterial or something similar to a bacterial mat that's laid over time. And so we can date that rock and figure out that first life started about 3.8 billion years ago, but it's prokaryotic. If we move forward through time, early in the history of life, photosynthesis starts. And so early in that atmosphere on our planet, there was no oxygen, but once you have photosynthesis, we start pumping O2 into the atmosphere. That actually leads to some extinctions on our planet because oxygen is very good at grabbing onto. It's highly electronegative, and so it turns a reducing kind of an atmosphere into an oxidizing atmosphere. But eventually, life starts to grab onto oxygen, so things like cellular respiration use the power of oxygen to drive that oxidative phosphorylation. So eventually, we have high amounts of oxygen in our planet, and eventually we start to see eukaryotic life show up. So this is going to be prokaryotic life. Eventually, we have eukaryotic life. Next thing that we're going to have is multicellular life starts to show up. Now we're about 1.5 billion years ago. Eventually we show up with animals in this Cambrian explosion. We have plants, we have the dinosaurs, and then this would be us way up here, humans. And so on this whole geologic time scale, humans show up right at the end. But there is this transition from no oxygen to oxygen, from prokaryotic life to eukaryotic life, from single cell to multi-cell, to the arrival of animals, plants, and then this movement eventually onto land. And so where do we get all of this evidence? It's just geologic. In other words, we're looking at rocks and we're using absolute dating and relative dating to figure out how old those rocks are. And so the nice thing about fossils is they give us a permanent record of what life was like on our planet. Next is chemical evidence. The most famous experiment is called the Miller-Urey experiment, and this is in the 1950s. Stanley Miller and Harold Urey tried to simulate what this early atmosphere was like on our planet. And so they tried to add the material, so water, methane, ammonia, hydrogen gas, carbon monoxide. They tried to kind of show what that early atmosphere was like on our planet. They added energy in the form of lightning, and then they collected the molecules that actually came from that. So they could stick a probe in here, and they could grab the organic material either out of here or out of here. And what they found is that amino acids started showing up. And so amino acids make proteins, and proteins make us. And so it's the building block of life. As we start looking at the chemical processes or the chemical equations that do that, it's fairly simple to go in two steps to amino acids. So we could take carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, and we can actually make things like, this would be formaldehyde, hydrogen cyanide, water. And so we can produce these things in a one-step process, and then we can eventually use these, or the products of this reaction, as reactants in this next reaction. We can actually make things like glycine. Glycine is a very simple amino acid. And so Miller and Urey were able to show that if you have a sterile environment where there's no oxygen, you can actually make the building blocks of life, which are those amino acids. Since then, a number of different experiments similar to the Miller-Urey experiment have shown that we can create the building blocks of the genetic code as well. In other words, the amino acids, not the amino acids, but the building blocks of RNA and DNA. Now, since that time, Jeffrey Beta, he actually worked in the lab with Miller, has looked through the vials that Miller did in the 1950s and found about 25 amino acids were created in that experiment. And the other interesting thing is that those amino acids that were created are what are called old amino acids. In other words, if you look through the genetic code, when we look at the oldest, most ancient of genes, we find that those code for amino acids, and a lot of those older amino acids are found in this Miller-Urey experiment. So chemistry shows us how life could have formed. And then finally, we can look at what we have today, which is life we have today. So again, if you don't exist as a life form anymore, you are extinct. And the opposite of that is extant. And so we can look at extant life forms on our planet. In other words, life that exists today, and we can find commonalities between that. And so we've come up with this term called the LUA, or the last universal ancestor. And so if we look at the history of life, this tree of life, it branches into the bacteria over here and the archaea and the eukarya over here. But all of life shares some of these common characteristics. In other words, it's based on DNA. It uses RNA. It uses proteins, ATP. uses a lipid bilayer or phospholipids, and finally goes through cell division. And so these characteristics are shared by all life on our planet. And so that suggests that all life came from this one common ancestor. If we had multiple genetic codes or multiple ways of metabolism, in other words, ways to get energy, then that would suggest that we had multiple common ancestors. But this actually, molecular evidence is showing us that Charles Darwin was right. There was one common ancestor to all life on our planet. Now, as a result of this, you can find some weird things. So this is a statistic that you could take or leave, but the idea is that 50% of the DNA in you and a banana is the same. Now, do you look like a banana? No. But you share half of your DNA. Now, if it was just random chance, since we have 4 letters in DNA, you'd share 25%. And so since we have 50%, that's more. And so what are some similarities that you have with a banana? Well, you have to use proteins. You have to make amino acids. You have to make energy, so you're going to use something like the Krebs cycle to do some of that. You have to make a membrane. And so there are certain things that are shared by all life on our planet. And those point back to this most ancient of ancestors. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is this, and this is kind of outside the scope of the class, but I think it's pretty interesting. If you look at life, we think, if we look back even before life formed, most scientists now agree that the universe started with something called a Big Bang, maybe something like, 11 billion years ago. So there's this huge explosion, we get this expansion of the universe, and as we move through time, so this time is going to be in this scale, we increase the entropy of the universe. In other words, the universe becomes less and less ordered, or more and more random through time. What's interesting is as it becomes more and more random, we actually find life moving in the opposite direction. In other words, we find life becoming more and more complex, spreading out, and we would say evolving over time. So all these different strategies. And so how do we reconcile that? How do we reconcile that the universe is becoming more random, but we're actually becoming more complex? Well, we do that at the expense of our universe. In other words, we can actually increase the randomness of the universe, and we can do that to create more complexity inside us. That's a little deep. But let me talk about something that's maybe makes a little more sense. This is Ray Kurzweil, and he's a futurist, so he's a really good inventor, invented text-to-speech and optical character recognition, but he's a futurist, and so what he's always thinking about is the future. And so this is a plot, and it's essentially a plot between time before now and then the time between each event. And these are the major events in the history of life. In other words, we begin with life, eukaryotic cells, the Cambrian explosion where animals show up, humans show up, agriculture, cities, industrial revolutions, computer, personal computer. And so what he does is he plots that on a logarithmic scale. So this is the time before now, and this is the time between each event. And what you find is that it looks linear. But what does that mean? If you're plotting it on a log scale and it looks linear, that means that all of this is exponential. In other words, the path of humans to today has been an exponential curve. In other words, it took a long time for life to show up, but once it did, then we eventually got eukaryotic, multicellular animals, and it's going exponential. And so when we look at the history of life, we should also think about the history of history. In other words, the history from the Big Bang to us today. And what we're finding is this exponential growth. In other words, it's amazing today that you're watching a podcast on the internet that can be shared by anybody across the whole of the planet. And so what's different here is that we've stepped outside of that evolution, which is random chance selected by an environment, and we've actually added something called culture. And so culture allows us to pass on information from one generation to the next, and that separates humans from all other animals on our planet. And it makes us pretty special. And it also points to a future that is going to be, crazy to say the least. And so I hope that's helpful.